Welcome back to the Sales Cadence Podcast. This is the podcast for everyone in sales, because everyone is in sales. We're all selling something. My name is Matt Sykes. I'm your host. I'm the author of the book Sales Glue and Converted. And if, like me, you're as passionate about helping people make truly epic buying decisions so that more people buy what you sell, great news. You're in the right place. Interesting time of the year. Here we are coming towards the end of January, the first month. And, I'd like to think that in most cases, most people are pretty optimistic at the beginning of the year. We've got another 11 months to go. Too early to tell how sales are performing in the first month because we're only 3 weeks in. Great ideas and expectations and full of optimism about the 12 or the 11 months to follow. And so most people, I believe, certainly this time of year that work in a sales environment, tend to be quite optimistic. Last year is gone. That result is over. Whether we got close, achieved, or smashed it out of the park is kind of been forgotten. It's one of the challenges, I guess, of working in sales is every month we wipe the slate clean and we move forward from a position of zero. But of course, the other thing about January is it is, certainly as far as those of us who live here in the UK is concerned, not every business, but quite a lot of businesses will have a financial year that runs from April to March. So in essence, we're less than 3 months away from finishing that financial year. So what January also does is it gives quite a lot of businesses that are on that financial year cycle the ability to know exactly where they are because they're 10 months in, 2 months to go, and they have the feedback now and the sales numbers to prove exactly whether they are going to hit that target or they're not. And ideally, let's hope everybody is. But if they're not, then thoughts start to think about April, the new financial year, and what are we going to do to mitigate the risk of not having a year like this year? Plenty of things that obviously will be on the agenda of what to do. One of those things is going to be, do we need to go and get some sales training to improve the team's performance? Can we get something in that supports them so that they are improving the way that they perform in the workplace? And obviously, being in that industry, of course, I'm going to say yes to that question. You would expect me to. But I'm also want to look at it from a serious point of view, which is you absolutely do need to have some kind of ongoing, regular training and coaching. Coaching is so important. We'll come on to that shortly. You need to have a regular training strategy in your business. And I'll tell you the reason why. There's a handful of things that come to mind. But first and foremost, we are in, whether we like it or not, and it's a fact of life, we are in a buyer-centric world. We are absolutely 100% in this place of making sure the buyer is front and center and safe. And everything that we do in a sales world is effectively predicated from what the buyer wants to achieve, not what we want to achieve as salespeople. Our job is simply to facilitate that conversation so that they make the decision to go and buy something. And so buyer centricity is 100% at the top of every salesperson's list, and it drives the activity that they do, at least the successful ones anyway. I would also say there's a change of demographic as well. The old guard are moving on. The new procurement purchasing specialists are coming into the marketplace. Of course, they're going to be younger, but they're going to be a different persona. They're a different personality to the ones that are leaving. Why? Because they're coming from a different world, a different generation. And so much of what the new buyer is all about is leaning into those stats that we hear so much about from the likes of Gartner, that the buyer is spending way more time than ever behind their desk doing research. Why? Because they can, because that market intelligence just sits there in front of them. And so we need to be aware of that as a sales industry, and we need to train and skill ourselves to know how to interact with a buyer that is spending way more time in their own company and less time in the company of a salesperson. So training and skilling our people to understand that key point is crucial. And of course, going hand in hand with that is the fact that so much now is shifted to the online world, and supporting salespeople to understand how they can leverage that global opportunity that sits in front of them, whether it's LinkedIn or whatever it is that they decide to do. That also requires some form of guidance and knowledge and education, support and training. And finally, of course, AI. And AI is no longer that shiny object that it was a couple of years ago when it first came onto the radar. Now it's just a way of life. And if you're in sales and you're not already using some form of AI, if you haven't got AI at least on your on your radar and your thought process, because even if you're not using it currently, you know that you should be. That's good. But if you're not even aware of it and you've got no plans to get involved with it, I'm going to tell you there's a big problem coming down the tracks. AI is here to stay. Of course it is. We are at the tip of the iceberg. Who knows what it's going to turn into in the next few years? But right at this moment in time, there is so much that you can leverage to your advantage by using some form of GPT. So being knowledgeable and being skilled in AI and in terms of how you would use that as a sales professional is critical. So, there's a handful of things there that come to mind where I'm asking myself the question, organizations that I work with, clients that I have, are they covered in those areas? Do they already have enough knowledge and experience to be able to be comfortable in front of tomorrow's buyer with tomorrow's technology today? That is why really sales training should be on everybody's agenda, and it's something that should be incorporated into every calendar year, every financial year. It needs to go into some kind of budget. You need to put some money aside, whether you train yourselves in-house, you go online and get some either free or cheap training from Udemy or LinkedIn Learning, whatever it might be, or you bring in an external training company, whichever works best for you. My encouragement is you should be doing that. But of course, there's a little bit of an elephant in the room, isn't there? Sales training does tend to get a fair amount of bad publicity. It certainly gets knocked on LinkedIn. Whether we like it or not, there is some training out there that draws bad publicity. But what I'm trying to achieve here on this episode today is, how can I help an organization that knows they've got a gap, that wants to help and support their sales team by bringing in some form of external training? How can I help them avoid falling into some of those traps that have created that negative publicity around sales training? And that's really what I want to do on this episode. I want to share with you some risks. Why can I do that? I've coming from 11 years now of training experience. So I've made all the mistakes myself, and I've seen a lot of this stuff out there, and I know what works and I know what essentially doesn't, and I also know how to spot a risk. And I want to share some of those risks with you. And hopefully at the end of this episode, if you found that there's been some useful information, if you are one of those CEOs, sales leaders that is responsible for going out and sourcing external sales training, then hopefully this episode gives you a little bit more inside information to make your life easier when it comes to making that decision. And if you're not, but you know somebody who is, share this episode with them. Because look, if I can just change one person, help one person make a good decision so that the money they invest in training pays back, then that's what this episode was designed to do, essentially. So yeah, let's get into it. So let's just explore some of these risks. Why does sales training tend to draw a kind of a negative publicity, certainly as far as LinkedIn is concerned? What's the substance behind that? What are those kind of red flags, or why does it sometimes fail? Let's be honest about it. Some sales training fails to deliver what it should deliver. Well, let's try and explore some of those things. I think the first one, and probably one of the reasons why it gets most bad publicity, is people tend to invest on a very short-term basis. They tend to reach out for one-off training. And there's a real high risk with that. Okay, first of all, why are we investing in a one-off? It could be becoming, a bit like I said earlier, we're coming to the end of a financial year. We've still got some money left in the budget. We should go and spend that money so that we can go and get that budget again next year. And so let's go out and get some training. It's a kind of a knee-jerk reaction, a one-off exercise, and you go out and you find someone. You Google a name, you Google sales training, you find the one in your area, you reach out to 2 or 3, you go through the motions, and then you find someone. So you're either spending the end of year budget, or worst case scenario, and I hope this doesn't happen, but I know in the past, in certain cases, I'm aware of organizations that have done this. Sales team haven't performed, must be sales team's fault. Let's go out and get some training, and if they don't improve, we'll get rid of them. Hard to believe that exists, but I believe there's a fair number of people that just assume that if you're going to put someone in a room with a sales trainer, then they're going to pull a rabbit out of a hat and miraculously solve whatever that sales problem is that you as a sales leader or a sales leader themselves can't fix. When it comes to any form of training, not just sales training, any form of training, health and safety training, root cause analysis training, one-off training is a challenge. There's a reason why pro sports teams train 2, 3, 4 times a week. And that's because they want to get better, because they want to be good at what they do. Practice makes perfect. I don't know if that's the correct expression. Practice makes permanent is probably a better one. Yeah. And if you think from a psychological perspective, we know from the field of psychology, it's going to take somewhere between 30 and 60 days to make a habit. We need to repeat every single day in order for that to become a habit. And we have to make sure that continues for 30, 40, 50, 60 days. So short-term one-off training is a high-risk strategy, quite often the reason why training fails. The next reason that comes to mind why sales training can sometimes not hit the mark, and as a consequence of that, it then gets labeled as being no good, is because it's not relevant. It's sometimes why I believe that off-the-shelf training always struggles to hit the mark. Here's a design course. It's got 15 different component pieces in it over the 2 days that's delivered. And the company goes out, they go onto Google, they look for sales training. Up comes page 1, page 2. They go through 3 or 4 providers. They go onto the website. They look at what the services and the training is that's on offer. And quite often, I would imagine that most organizations are trying to get as much as they can for their buck. And so they look for a training which is packed full of information. And they go, well, that's definitely going to tick all of the boxes because it's, in my words, that's your classic catch-all. But of course, the problem with that is it's not specific or relevant, or there's a high risk that it won't be, to the problem or the challenges that the organization is trying to address or fix. And so what happens is the delegate goes into a room and they're sort of hit with this Chinese menu full of different things machine gunned at them. And look, some of that may be really relevant and it could work, but most of it probably either won't be, or if it is, it's coming at them at such a speed, the brain cannot make the link between what they're hearing and then how to translate that advice, that knowledge, into the day job. And so training can often fail because it's not relevant to the delegate that's walking into the room to attend the training. Third reason that came to mind was off the back of that second point there about relevance and Chinese menu, and was really about memory overload. And I know in the past, in my early days of training, going back 10 years, 11 years ago, I'm quite guilty of this myself, cramming just too much information in to a training day or a training course, training program, death by content, loads of bullet points, lots of images, loads of exercises, almost creating a chronological time-based agenda for myself. And if I didn't hit that certain time, then I need to go and catch up and speed through the next half an hour, condense that into 15 minutes to get to the next. You can start to see how this kind of memory overload can quite easily come into place. And if you're trying to cram stuff in and it's not going in, then it's pointless. That whole experience that we all hear about sometimes as training's a bit like edutainment. Someone's trying to educate you, but it's more like someone standing at the front of the room just providing some form of entertainment. Quite often the best way to help people learn is to limit what you deliver, but just really hyper-focus down on each of those things and almost limit it to 3 things and ensure that training delivery to help people, allow them to accept the information, for it to go into their heads, for them to see the relevance of it, make the link with, well, how will this help me in the day job? And therefore, provide exercises that prove that so that people can actually go and put it into practice during the training itself. That all helps limit memory overload. It makes it a little bit more real, and you've got a much better chance of the delegates leaving with that information stored. So memory overload can also be a reason why training can fail. The fourth thing that I thought of was, and this is a weird one when you think about it, because the whole purpose of sales in principle is to understand the other person first before you decide whether or not it's something that you can help them with. And so, the risk that I sometimes see people falling foul of when they go out to the market to get sales training is there's no diagnosis. Now, for sure, a business will do their own diagnosis because they'll understand they've got a sales result shortfall and they'll blame the sales team, and then they'll say, well, we need to go and get some sales training. So they'll go through some kind of self-diagnosis that quite often people will come to me and ask me for some kind of training. When we get into that, well, why do you think you need it? And tell me a little bit more about the problem you're trying to solve. Quite often we find that they've self-diagnosed incorrectly. And so training will fail if it's not diagnosed correctly at the start. The irony is that an organization that delivers training, if they're not diagnosing what is the problem you're trying to fix, then they're not a sales training company at all. They are an edutainment company. How do you know what to fix if you don't know what needs fixing, would be my question. The next thing that came to mind when I started to create this list in my head of why does sales training get such a bad press on LinkedIn? Well, it's because sometimes it fails. Okay, well, why does it fail? And the next thing that came to mind was this lack of aftercare. So some of you will be familiar with the Ebbinghaus curve, but the Ebbinghaus curve effectively is a piece of work that was done many, many years ago, but basically confirmed that when we are exposed to new information, we will be unable to retain long term. In fact, 50% of what we're exposed to we'll lose in the first 60 minutes of having heard it. That's staggering when you think about it, isn't it? But if you put yourself in that situation yourself right now, think about the one big takeaway you remember from the best training you ever went on, irrespective if that was sales training or something else. You could probably come to that conclusion and probably, I went on some kind of training mat and this is the thing I remember. But if I said, well, go and tell me what the second thing was, at that point we start to struggle. If we haven't got some kind of aftercare in place, the what happens next, that's where it all starts to really dismantle itself. It's one of the biggest sins, I think, of any sales training provider is not asking the client, what are you going to do after I've left? The next thing that came to mind was, off the back of that point, is a lack of practice. And there are two things I want to just briefly touch on when I talk about a lack of practice. Because if you don't practice stuff, new stuff, you won't get any better at it. Professional sports teams train 3 times a week. They don't want to be practicing on match day on a Saturday, because that would make sense. They want to practice Monday, Wednesday, Thursday to be good on Saturday. And a lack of practice in the sales environment can go in 2 different directions. Number one, practice actually in the training itself. And again, 2 words that will send shivers down some people's backs is role play. So I like to use the word practice rather than role play. It's the same thing at the end of the day. But in any training I deliver, obviously assuming the content warrants it, there'll be an element of practice. I want to see people put into practice what we've just talked about. And the reason why sometimes we don't do that is A, because there's a bit of a stigma around the words role play. And second of all, because we fail to create an environment in that training room where it's safe. And that's down to the trainer. We should be providing a safe environment where we are encouraging failure. That's what we want to happen. We want people to get it wrong, not on purpose, but we want to create an inclusive and safe culture where it's okay to fail, because that's where the learning happens. We've talked about it. We've discussed it. We all agree that it's the right thing for you to adopt in the day job. But before you go there, let's spend the next half an hour just practicing it together. And the second thing I would say as well is, and it comes off this point of no aftercare, organizations, certainly sales organizations, if they've not got in their diaries regular weekly practice sessions, I'm going to ask you why you haven't. No one's that good that they don't need to practice. Pro sports teams don't practice on match day. Let me just repeat that. Pro sports teams do not practice on match day. They want to make the mistakes in private so that they don't make mistakes in public. The last reason why I think training fails is there's an absence of leadership in the room. And so an organization will go out, they'll source some sales training, and the sales director who's in charge, that leader, puts their delegates in the room, but they don't go themselves. Make your own minds up to why that is. Maybe they know it all, or perhaps they don't know much, and there's a slight fear there that they may get, exposed in that room. Maybe there's a third one, again, and I've known this to be true, that sometimes sales directors have a fear of going into the room because they don't want to disrupt or influence the people that are there. They want the people to feel safe. Well, I would hold that mirror back up to them and go, well, why have you got that concern in the first place? What's going on in your business that means that people wouldn't feel safe if you're in the room? So I'll leave that one hanging there. I think that's one for another podcast. So if there's an absence of leadership in the room, here's what goes wrong. First of all, what message is that saying to your team? But the big problem is they're going to go into an environment, they're going to learn some new stuff. And when they come out of that room, they're going to start to apply that new stuff. And if you don't know what that is, that new knowledge, that new process, that new technique, then how on earth are you going to know if it's happening or not? And quite quickly what will happen is, because you won't know that, you won't be able to help them. You won't be able to coach them. And as I said at the top, coaching is so critical to training. That they are bedfellows. You can't have one without the other. You can't coach someone unless there's something worth coaching about. And that's probably why you need to train someone first. And you can't train someone without coaching afterwards, because without the coaching afterwards, Ebbinghaus kicks in and it's quickly forgotten. And so if a leader isn't involved in that training, isn't experiencing that training, isn't aware of what that new knowledge and content is, They won't see it being applied, and very, very quickly will return back to the old ways, and then you've lost everything.
You're listening to the Sales Cadence podcast. It's like other sales podcasts, just not as interesting.
So we've discussed some risks, but let's look at the upsides now. So, I'm living proof that sales training works. So I made a career out of it. I have a slight chuckle when I see people who say it doesn't on LinkedIn, but hey, they don't know what I know, and that's okay. But let's come to a kind of conclusion in this podcast with some tips on how can we make it succeed. So we've already talked about the risks, the red flags. Well, what are some of the questions we can ask ourselves or ask of the trainer to make sure that we have a greater chance of turning our investment into a higher return back end? Because that's ultimately what you're doing. You don't really want the sales training. What you want is the upside or the outcome of why you've got the training in the first place. You'll go through that training process, no problem at all, but you're going through it because you want to get the result. So how do we help organizations go and get that result? Well, here are some questions that you should be asking yourself and asking that organization. Number one, what is the purpose? What is the point of this? What is the thing that we need to fix, improve, remove, be better at? Because it has to start at the end, not the beginning. Agree what the outcome needs to be and then design the training to meet that expectation. So what is the purpose is the first question you need to ask. The second question is, who's going to be in the room? As a sales trainer, I want to intrinsically understand who are the delegates. I want their names. I want to go and check them out on LinkedIn. If I'm really lucky, and sometimes I do insist on this, I want to go and meet with them. I want to go and have a conversation with them. I want to understand their personality type. Have we got some extroverts? Have we got some introverts? Some people in the room are going to be quite advanced, quite experienced, others less so. So what are those ability levels? Very important is, what's their learning style? How do they like to learn? Now, I can't cater for everybody if they're all different, but having that knowledge does give me an advantage in the way that I deliver that training. So who's in the room is really important. And it's a little bit why I always try and direct my clients to that sales audit I have on my website. Third question you'd want to ask yourself is, of those guys and girls that you're going to put in that room, do they know why they're attending? Now, do they know why they've been sent, speech marks, to a training session or going through a period of 6 months training? In my experience, a number of people don't know. Some people might feel a bit pissed off about it. Some people might assume that sales training is because they're not very good at what they do. So it's really important that they are able to understand why they are going to sales training, what's in it for them. So communicate in advance, share the before and afters. So if you did do that audit, show them the results. Say, look, we're a bit weak here, and so we're going to go and help you guys and girls. We're going to go and do some training to improve that area right there. When you share and communicate in advance why people are going into training, why you'd want to help them improve, and what you expect when they come out, life tends to get a lot easier. People then tend to turn up. There's no surprises. They lean in a bit more. They're more involved. They're more engaged. Number 4 is, have you given as much thought about what happens after as you have done about the training itself? In terms of what's expected afterwards is, what will they be able to do as a consequence of doing this training? And not only that, can that be measured? Can you say, here's where we are at the moment, and can we get an increase of 10%? And if we can't get an increase of percentage-wise, what are the key performance indicators? What's going on in the business 6 months after we've done the training that says actually doing the training was the right thing to do? Are you giving as much thought about what's happening after the training as you do when you go out and select a training provider? That would be the 4th question I would want you to ask yourself. And then the final question I would ask, how will it be reinforced afterwards? What are you going to put in place that's going to reinforce the learning, support it so that we create long-term behavioral change? You're now giving a responsibility to that team of people, not only to attend and engage and then soak up that knowledge and then apply it into the day job. You've then got to make sure they apply it into the day job every day thereafter. And then so much of that responsibility then shifts from them as a delegate and onto you as a sales leader. Leadership's responsibility in all of this is to support, create an infrastructure which allows it to be maintained so that they then in return close the loop. Because the loop at the one end is investing money, the loop at the other end closes by getting your money back and some. And that's what that change ultimately pays back. So last question I would ask is, how will it be reinforced? How will it be supported? And what responsibility does the organization play in that part to make sure that those two things happen? So look, here's hoping some of that was useful for you if you're an organization that's currently thinking about, okay, what does 2025 look like? Are we geared up for success? Do we need to go in the marketplace? Do we need to train our team or not? If you don't, fantastic. If you do, then maybe some of this stuff has been quite useful for you. You know, sales training is a really fundamental key part of your annual sales process. You know, if you are not consistently keeping on top and up with the changes in the sales industry and keeping up to speed with the changes that your buyer is making, you're going to get left behind. And hopefully this isn't sounded like some kind of sales pitch for sales training. For me, it's not, but there are some key things just to keep front in mind. There's reasons why it fails. It's normally the exception, not the norm, but the reasons why it fails is it's short term. It's a one-off, it's a half day, it's a one day, and it's never get repeated and it's lost. It's not relevant. You get an off-the-shelf product, it's trying to be catch-all, it catches nothing. Or you go the other way where you've got this massive bombardment of information, you get memory overload and none of it sticks. Worse than that, you go to a training course that hasn't been, first of all, diagnosed why on earth you want the training in the first place, and you end up at the mercy of whatever that training is providing. And if you don't diagnose what the problem is that you're trying to achieve with the training, don't be surprised if you don't achieve it. It's as important, if not more so, to know what you're going to do once the training provider is gone, as it is to know exactly what the training provider is going to deliver. If you don't practice as well, that's going to be a problem. You may experience some of the best training on the planet. But if you don't practice what you've learned and continue to practice, take 60 days to make a habit. If you don't practice over the next 2 months, don't be surprised if you realize that you've wasted your money because people aren't doing what they were taught to do. And finally, and this is on the rare occasion, there's an absence of leadership. They, for whatever reason, they just don't want to be in the room with their sales team. And that brings a double whammy. First of all, your team will come out of that room with new information and they'll want to reinforce and practice and support, and they'll ask you questions about it and you can't answer them because guess what? You weren't there. And very, very quickly then you default back to the old habits that you were doing, which were the reasons why you called the training provider in the first place. So look, hopefully that was of use. If it wasn't of use to you, but you think there's someone in your network that you think might be interested to learn about the pitfalls of sales training and some of the things that can help mitigate those risks, do me a big favor and send them the link to this episode. I'll be super grateful. I think they'll be even more grateful than me. Thanks ever so much for tuning in, folks. Look forward to seeing you on the next one.